Namaskara and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast brought to you by Bangalore International Centre, where we present conversations that move, inform, and encourage discourse.
I have not bowed. I never will. The one who listens stands resplendent within me. That is worship. That is what I do. I have not bowed. I never will. The one who listens stands resplendent within me. That is worship. That is what I do. These are not women who are interested in becoming custodians of God. They're not interested in the wisdom of the priests and the pundits and the cultural sentinels and the religious gatekeepers of the world. They're not interested in being custodians because they want to become conduits of the divine.
Wild Women, Seekers, Protagonists and Goddesses in Sacred Indian Poetry, edited by poet and seeker Arundhathi Subramaniam, is a new anthology of compelling women mystics in Indian literature. The poems it includes are the cries of women who refused quietly, and sometimes not so quietly, to be bullied into submission, women who surrendered not to the authority of the world, but to the authority of the spirit, women whose voices have far too often been sanitized by the grand narratives of religion and sidelined by the rationalist versions of history. Although Mirabai, Akka Mahadevi and Andal are well known, the urgency of their words, their feral sensuality, their relentless questioning of gender and faith remain unknown to many. In this episode, Arundhathi Subramaniam will discuss some fascinating and unforgettable women, interspersed with readings by Mani Rao, Vanamala Vishwanatha and Ahalya Balal. This episode was adapted from an event that took place in June of 2024 at the Bangalore International Centre.
There is a temple that I go to, a Dakshinamurti temple, which is encircled by murtis of a number of gurus. Matsyendranath, Gorakhnath, Jalandharnath, Kanifanath, Charapatinath, Naganath, Bhattarinath, Revananath, Gahaninath, all male. There's a problem here. Although the first guru of each one of us is our mother, although there are numerous seekers and adepts among women, although there are so many goddesses in India, one for every village, why do the majority of seers and seekers seem to be men, more visible, more articulate? And this is what is resolved by this anthology. Wild Women is a rebalancing act. Steadily, methodically, Arundhathi Subramaniam plumbs the time and space of the Indian region to shine a new light on women seekers, protagonists and goddesses. She opens the curtains to the less known and vibrant areas, the women power of our history. Reading this anthology, I felt like I was being introduced to a new heritage, a new sampradaya. Lakshminkara, who composed Advaya Siddha, Toral, Linal, Loyan of Saurashtra, yoginis from Odisha, Jiradaye, who authored Jhamak Gita, Madhavi Dasi, Taj Bibi, who adored Krishna, Padma Priya, the first Assamese poet, and Shenkottai Andai Akkal, my new best friend. At the same time, it's not just women as gender. It's women as a role. And we find out how male poet seekers adopt the female voice, the condition of femininity. And vulnerability is not the opposite of power. And divisions are blurred. To quote Uddhava Das, who can tell who is the man, who is the woman in this ecstasy? The second feature of this book is its collective effort, collective enterprise, and generosity. It takes the limelight of posterity and paints it more generously, not just remembering Mirabai, Andal, Akka Mahadevi, Lalred, but calling in Indra Devi, Kanhopatra, Molla. The scale of this book is vast. It is an enterprise of translation and translators. Arundhathi has put a whole army of poets to work here. A multitude of women voices from history and legend speaking through a multitude of poetic voices today. The force of the past and the present stand as one here towards a more balanced future. While Women will prove to be a significant reference book, this book is ambitious, and it is an ambition realized. I'm delighted to be in conversation with the person, seeker, and protagonist, Arundhathi Subramaniam, who created this anthology. Please tell us the genesis of the book, of the concept, what triggered it, what started it, why did you do it? I know that your last book was Women Who Wear Only Themselves, and that also seems to have a women theme. How is this your particular interest? Can you tell us? Yeah.
First, thank you, Mani. I'm particularly glad that we are having this conversation. It's not always that one has a conversation with someone who has a journey of their own, and particularly an articulated spiritual journey. So I'm very glad that we're having this dialogue. And thank you all, those of you who are here on a rainy evening in Bangalore with innumerable demands on your time, I have no doubt. Thank you very much for choosing to be here. I think this particular book, it started, Mani, to answer your question, it started ostensibly 5 years ago. But if I were to be completely honest, it's probably been almost a lifetime in the making. And there are many ways in which one could start this question of, or try to explore this question of beginnings. I'd say, as a woman and a poet and a lover of poetry, every time I read sacred literature, I was always struck by the fact that the women I encountered were bloodless, frequently bodiless, ethereal sprites. They just seemed to have turned into little puffs of vapor. And I yearned, I think, as a woman myself, and I think many of us have felt this as modern creative practitioners as well, one yearned to hear about embodied women. Women who had hungers, women who had hormones, women who had appetites for life and for a deeper life. So I think that was one possible starting point. And this struck me years ago when I was in my adolescence, a very omnivorous reader of spiritual literature. I chafed because I just didn't find these voices. And later I found, of course, there are a few celebrated voices, all the ones that she mentioned. There's Mirabai, whom we've all heard of. There's Andal. There is Akka Mahadevi. Some of us have heard of Lalred. But all of them, it seemed to me, and particularly Mirabai, from the way I remember her in an Amar Chitra Katha, she seemed to have turned into this white, demure, unreal figure, kind of calendar art. She had been flattened into the state of sanctified specimenhood that I found very uncomfortable. And she seemed to look beatifically heavenward all the time. And it just felt like, surely there is another Mirabai, or who is she anyway? And the same with Andal, who is much deified in the south. So who were the women behind these flattened portraits of, this plaster sainthood. That was one question. And the other is, I think more recently, the fact that I'm deeply grateful to all the male mystics and poets that I've read down the ages. I'm very deeply grateful to them. The gurus too. From St. John of the Cross to Hafiz, from Tukaram to Nammalvar, and so many more. So this is not intending to set up some kind of opposition where none need exist. But what did strike me is the fact that while I'm deeply grateful for this heritage, where is the other half of the story? And I think this is a thirst that many of us feel without often acknowledging it. I think there's a very deep thirst in all of us for a less lopsided, more inclusive legacy of culture and spirituality.
Legacy is absolutely, I think, a spot-on word for this, because even as I was reading it, I was getting that sense of like a new legacy having been constructed, a matrilineal, a whole history, right from, of course, the book opens with Vak, and then you have the Buddhist nuns, the Therigatha, and right from the early centuries of the first millennium through the 12th century, 13th century, 14th century, we see a whole historical sort of progression of voices, and it seems as if they were always there. Of course they were there. But how come they're not actually so much in our consciousness? The time that you're talking about, let us say 20 years ago, I too was reading those same books, Autobiography of a Yogi, and of course the Ramakrishna's Gospel. And of course in Ramakrishna's Gospel, he's always warning people about women and gold. He's always warning people about women and gold. So it was always the male yearning for the spirit or for an inner life, and the woman was always the problem. Whereas when you take that and turn it around and say, but what about women? Of course they have an inner life. And where are all the expressions of that, So that, I think, is a very interesting question. And Arundhathi has actually pulled it out of the woodwork, pulled it out of history.
I think, Mani, it was very important for me when putting this anthology together. It was very important for me to have women of very different temperaments and backgrounds. So I started with what I thought was an elegantly curated list of about 20-odd women poets. I said maybe 25. And then they kept tumbling out of the woodwork as I started searching for them. And I discovered so many more. And to return to exactly what you said, the very Ramakrishna who speaks of Kamini Kanchan is also the Ramakrishna who directs us to the goddess, is also the Ramakrishna who has Bhairavi Brahmani as his guru, so as one of his teachers. So this is I think it's just a parallel stream, subterranean, that was just waiting to be acknowledged, really, more than anything else. So one of the things I knew as I started putting this together is that I wanted, for one, women of very different backgrounds. So there are the Buddhist nuns, there are Vedantins like Shengote Avudeyakal, there are tons of bhaktas, there are Sufis, there are Tantrikas like Jiradei and Lakshminkara, and I wanted all of them. I also wanted women of very different orientations, some more cerebral, some more devotional, some more meditative, contemplative, others more ecstatic. And I wanted women who had made very different life choices. This was important to me too. And I think this comes from, you mentioned Women Who Wear Only Themselves, my previous book. And one of the reasons for giving it that title was the fact that these were women who have exercised very different choices as far as their spirituality is concerned. But the sartorial metaphor was important in that book. So one woman in that book wears a monk's apparel, the other chooses to peel off all her clothes, and a third chooses to give up ochre and wear blue jeans. I wanted to honor each of those choices. And in this book, it isn't very different. There are the nuns, the Buddhist nuns, who presumably wore their ochre. There are householders, many women in the Vachana tradition, as we know in Karnataka, who walked alongside men who were their spiritual companions. The most exciting for me are the women poets of Saurashtra, the Gujarati women poets, because not only do they have male partners who are also their spiritual companions, they're also sometimes their devotees. So there's this lovely woman, Toral. Toral has a very happy marriage. Then Toral is abducted by a dacoit from Kutch, and Toral remains poised. A storm breaks out. The dacoit is terrified. Jaisal is terrified. Toral remains poised. And Jaisal finally falls at her feet and says, "Who are you?" And that's how his spiritual journey begins. So while many of these women acknowledge male gurus, they are also transformers in their own right.
And in that particular poem, when Toral is advising Jaisal about the spirit, about how to progress. So it's like the role of a teacher,
Very much so.
Very interesting. And how many women's voices are here, you think? Like 50, 100?
There are 56 women.
56 women. And I started with thinking, do I know 5 or 6 women's voices whom I can really think of? If I thought more, I could pull out maybe another 5, maybe another 5. But 50 was a shock to me. To go through this anthology, I discovered a lot of voices. Some of them, Arundhati, very interestingly, the format struck me. Of course, like for example, Basava, we all know Basava. But here we have his 2 wives and we have his sister, who are also seekers in their own right. And their expressions and their poetry is really fascinating. And, it's like the limelight has always been on Basava. But what about these other voices that belong to women, right? Similarly, you have a servant in Namdev's household who is a woman servant, and she is a poet and seeker. It's fascinating how you have women from the shadows of the men.
In fact, that's exactly it. It just felt like these women have far too long been cameos. It felt like it was time to invite them center stage. Far too often, I think there are 2 kinds of problems here. One is that religious narratives often tend to sanitize, whitewash, and give us antiseptic women, unreal women. That's one problem. And the other is that there are rationalist narratives that sideline them entirely and don't consider them important at all. So somewhere between the 2, it feels like there is a vast sisterhood waiting to be recovered. And this, for me, was really about recovering ancestry. It was about recovering a powerful ancestry. Women who are not just obsequious followers, women who are not just groveling devotees, but strong, powerful women on their own journeys of discovery and self-reclamation. To me, that was important.
And not only the figures, but also the traditions. Like you have from the Alvars, you have then from the Nayanmars, you have Karaikal Ammayar, then you have the Sharana tradition, you have the Charyapada. Each of these groupings that we all recognize as congregations of voices in history, like little flashpoints in history where people have articulated themselves. There were women in those points. Absolutely, yeah.
And in fact, I wondered at one point if I should how to organize this book. Should it have been organized, I wondered, on the basis of chronology, or should it be theological, sectarian, regional, linguistic? I toyed with all of that. And yes, there is a chronological organization, but essentially it is for me...
in the first part, though,
in
right?
the first section of the book. But essentially it is for me really about just naming women. I wanted them to be named. And in the act of naming, I believe we are honoring them with the simple act of attention and dignity, according them the dignity that they deserve. This, I think, is a deep pain that many carry around. it's a deep pain in many of us. The sense of just wanting the attention, the simple act of attentiveness for a little moment in time. And that's what the naming strategy was about, essentially.
And speaking of organization, the book is in 3 parts, and seekers, protagonists, and goddesses. So the first part has got women seekers. The second part has got protagonists, and you please do, elaborate on that for us. It's got male voices who assume the role of women in their expressions. And the third section is goddesses. Could you maybe just expand on these 3 sections a little bit? So what are the contents and what is the impetus in them? Yeah.
I think I knew initially it was to be a book of women mystic poets. That's how I thought of it. But almost as soon as I said wild women, as soon as I said it to myself, and the title suggested itself very early, almost immediately it felt like we needed the woman as seeker and the woman as sought. So the goddesses entered. And how can one not include those male poets who have given us some of the most memorable female protagonists? How can one not include them? I mean, when I read a Kabir or I read Shah Abdul Latif, and they have these women who stand tall and stand center stage, women willing to walk out into the dead of night, into a journey where success means no return, women who are willing to throw respectability and decorum to the winds.
You mean like
in their quest for freedom?
Like Radha or
well, Radha
or
too.
Themselves, yeah.
Radha too. No, the women that they channel, the women protagonists. So it felt like these protagonists had to be there. And then, as I read further, I was amazed at what happened to the male poet's voice when he assumed the female persona, when he actually spoke as the woman, not merely of the woman, but as the woman. And frequently, in certain cases, especially when you see Annamacharya, for instance, the 15th century Telugu poet, when Annamacharya speaks to his god, it's a male god, it's Venkatesha of Tirupati, but when he speaks to his male god as a male seeker, the tone is imploring, it's beseeching. But when he speaks as a female seeker, it is a very different kind of voice. This is not just any seeker. This is a goddess in her own right. And she's a feisty, opinionated, temperamental goddess who knows she is as desired by this god as she desires him. So this, to me, is what the male poets often bring into the poetry.
So the template of Eros
Here,
comes in through gender
in this
switching.
particular, in Annamacharya's poetry, and you find it, of course, in some of the others too. You find it in Vidyapati, Chandidas. It is the male poet channeling the female voice, and there is suddenly an erotic charge to the poetry. There is a much more egalitarian relationship with the divine in the poetry. Something changes. And that interested me.
What about when there is a feminine divine? When the male poet's addressing the feminine divine?
Yes, so that's the entire third section. And, that was a section in which I made such discoveries personally. And, there is a belief that it's largely the male poet and the female divine. And it is true, there is a wonderful heritage of male poets who speak to their goddesses, and often as the mother, mostly as the mother, but a very intimate mother. So when it comes to the Bengali poets of the 18th and 19th centuries, it's an intimate, almost backslapping relationship, which is possible with a mother. Intimacy is the cornerstone of it. But at the same time, I didn't want just the male poets in there. So that section has, on the one hand, it has devotees speaking to the goddess. There is the Chanda Maharoshana Tantra, which has the goddess speaking herself. So the goddess has a voice. There is the goddess as mother. There is also the goddess as lover, Alamelu Manga in Annamacharya.
That's a dramatic monologue kind of
It
thing,
is,
yeah.
where he actually channels the voice. And there is there is the poetry of adoration, but there is also the poetry of argument, which I love. The fact that you can have an argumentative relationship with the divine. Not just an erotic one, but an argumentative one. You can quarrel with this goddess and with this god.
Could you share an example, maybe?
Yes, in fact, I should have shared examples long ago. I'm sorry, I should have been reading poems. Okay. I feel it feels wrong to go right to the last section. Should I not be reading some of the earlier ones?
Let's have the argument first.
Okay. Let me read you my favorite, which is, well, there'll be arguments with the women too, but we're going to start with a male poet, unfortunately. We'll come back to the women. There are plenty of women. Maybe the man I should read you is in fact the one I spoke of, Annamacharya. Annamacharya's heroine, Alamelumanga, is this flirtatious goddess who, of course, is in love with Venkatesha, who, like all gods, cannot have a monogamous relationship. Gods cannot. They're busy doing other things. So she has her own equation with him. So when he comes and he's clearly trying to woo her, she says, unless I want it myself, it doesn't count as love. So this is an extraordinary statement of mutuality coming from a 15th century poet, only when he is able to channel the female voice. So here's Alamelumanga in a poem that I love to read. She tells you, and this is a poem that works perfectly as a romantic poem, as most of you will recognize. Works perfectly as a romantic poem and perfectly as a mystical poem, where she says time and again, he's the boss. And you know what she really means. He's the master. What can I say when he says I'm better than the others? I don't even have to ask. He takes whatever I say as a command. Why should I brag? My husband is under my thumb. He's the master. Who am I to serve him when he takes joy in serving me? How can I tell you the 1,000 ways he's with me? He knows everything, just like God. And he praises me. He's the master. I'm always in his arms. He's always laughing with me. He's the God on the hill. And I'm Alamelumanga. Do I have to make a statement? He's my slave. He's the master. What on earth is she saying? And of course we know it. This is the language of poetry. We recognize it, and we don't even need to understand it. We recognize it immediately, that both these are, of course, perfectly true. He's the master. He's my slave. That's David Shulman and V. Narayana Rao. I think that's what the male poets bring, I think we realize as we are drawn to this rising ardor of the bedchamber, where the sexual union is a metaphor, of course, for the spiritual union, as we are drawn there as the listener, we are being invited to a place of such betweenness that all identities collapse, all hierarchies collapse. We don't know where the man ends and the woman begins. We don't know where the divine ends and the human begins. We don't know where God ends and the bhakta begins. And we don't know who's superior and who's inferior.
One difference I found among the women voices and the men's voices was that women talk about, release me from these shackles. Please get rid of my mother-in-law, my sister-in-law, my husband, so then it's just you and me. They talk about that's a format, and that's absolutely an ask. Whereas the men don't seem to do that.
Well, presumably because that was not a shackle for them, right? It has never been. I think that's self-evident, the reasons why it doesn't happen. Yeah. But I will also say that what excites me about the women is, yes, they talk about kill my mother-in-law, as perhaps one should sometimes, but they also say other things. They also talk, this interests me, Mani, they talk about their own journeys of freedom. And to me, there are so many moments of freedom that are not predicated on mothers-in-law or men in the women poets. So, for instance, you have someone like Dayabai, the 18th century Hindi poet, who says, I became an acrobat girl and I caper across the vaults of the sky. This is a transcendent moment. This is not predicated on anyone else. And it's moments like that. It's Patachara, the Buddhist nun, 2,500 years ago. I mean, this is a voice that sounds like it was today. Patachara just talks of going into her cell. It's just one day like any other. She washes her feet and she watches the water flow, high to low. She just watches the flow of water, goes into her cell, pulls up the candle wick. It is such a small, inconsequential detail. She says, I just pulled up the wick of my lamp and I was realized. So it is a thunderclap moment, but with such a wealth of quotidian detail behind it.
Actually, that is a very interesting particular, because the meaning of nirvana is blowing out. And it is the pulling of...
She pulls it up.
Yeah, takes out the wick. That's
To
fascinating.
me, this is exciting, yes. But it's also interesting to me that these happen not as big moments. They're not celebrated. This is not the Buddha's celebrated nirvana. It is an ordinary nirvana.
And not only are they, of course, there is the whole play, the humor about, the mother-in-law humor that I talked about. But also there is real wisdom in what they're talking about. You have Shenkotai, who talks about, is it Ekil or Etchil? Etchil. She talks about Juta, right? Yengili in Telugu. She talks about how there is no such thing. The egalitarianism, the sort of the dismissal of hypocrisy and of orthodoxy.
I think also the orthodoxy and the body.
And the body.
The body. In some way, the body cannot be ignored. And I think the women poets bring it to us up front and center. Whether it is someone like Amrapali, the beautiful courtesan 2,500 years ago, whom we've all seen as Vaijayanti Mala, of course. But this is not the beautiful Vaijayanti Mala stroke Amrapali. This is an aging Amrapali, looking down at her body. This is the body that is decaying. And I believe, and I hope some of you will pick up the book and read the poem for yourself, in that particular poem, she looks down at the body and there is regret and sadness, but there's also wonder. Wonder at the beauty of this, that this body once was, at the possibility that it once was. So yes, there is
strong integration between the body and the spirit.
And I'd say this is
awareness of the body is the instrument for it.
The instrument, and in the process, the orthodoxies are questioned. So whether it's the Dalit woman poet Mirabai, who says, if menstrual blood makes me impure, tell me who wasn't born of that blood. Whether it's Shengote Avude Akal, who takes the very trope of menstruation and celebrates it. These are women who don't let us escape the body, but in fact, I think, remind us that they're not just interested, and this, I have to read you a poem. They're not just interested in passively worshipping the divine. They're interested in embodying the divine. To me, this is what, say, for instance, a poet whom I had never heard of until I discovered her, by happenstance. It was a wonderful moment of discovery. This is the 17th century Kashmiri poet, Rupa Bhavani. And we have some of the translators in the audience, and I'm going to ask them very soon to come up and read more poems. But before that, allow me to read Rupa Bhavani to you, if I can find her. I love her, really. She's, for me, the discovery, one of the big discoveries of this book. Rupa Bhavani says in this poem, I have not bowed, I never will. The one who listens stands resplendent within me. That is worship. That is what I do. I have not bowed, I never will. The one who listens stands resplendent within me. That is worship. That is what I do. These are not women who are interested in becoming custodians of God. They're not interested in the wisdom of the priests and the pandits and the cultural sentinels and the religious gatekeepers of the world. They're not interested in being custodians because they want to become conduits of the divine.
This is fascinating. So the men actually take on women's voices. When we talk about how they take on the feminine condition, we're not talking about servility and subservience. We're actually talking about becoming more empowered and becoming more able to have a relationship with the divine. So that's the unexpected turn, I think, in that. Yeah.
We can move to translations, but not without my reading you, Janabai. I have to read the woman who inspired the title of this particular session. Janabai was a 13th century maidservant in the home of Namdev, a celebrated poet. And hers is one of the most interesting and the most courageous voices that I've encountered. And her relationship with Namdev is her guru. She has a certain respect, deep respect for Namdev. But when it comes to Vitthala, her god, the relationship is one of backslapping familiarity. So when she's tired, Vitthala will do the dishes for her. When she's even more exhausted, Vitthala will wash her hair. When he's tired, sometimes Janabai will cook a meal for him, and he belches his love all over her. So it's a very endearing relationship with the divine. And so Janabai is able to say, with the kind of jauntiness that only Janabai can say it with, especially when she is translated by Arun Kolatkar, I eat God. I drink God. I sleep on God. I buy God. I count God. I deal with God. God is here. God is there. Void is not devoid of God. God is within. God is without. And what's more, there's God to spare. It seems like, thank you, it feels like the right moment to invite on stage Vanamala Vishwanatha, who's translated Akka Mahadevi, and of course to be reading Akka Mahadevi here in Karnataka feels deeply right. Vanamala.
Both the speakers were talking about the body and embodiment as the mode through which spirituality, finds its expression. And Akka is all body, but it is the woman's spirit in that body that she, that voices whatever she's saying. And I won't explain too much because the poems say who she is. So just look at this. There's some nakra also here, which is what I love. Hear me if you will, spurn me if you want. I cannot but sing your praises, Ayya. See me if you will, shun me if you want. I cannot but delight in you, Ayya. Cherish me if you will, detest me if you won't. I cannot but embrace you, Ayya. Love me if you will, loathe me if you won't. I cannot but adore you, Ayya. Chenamallikarjunayya, applauding you, celebrating you, I shall dance in ecstasy, Ayya. Right? So, what a celebration of the moment, right? And her vulnerability they were talking about. What power in this vulnerability to own up, what she feels. And I thought maybe I could, read it in Kannada also for you. In a way, it's a suicidal act to juxtapose one's translation against the original. But Akka deserves. So, Ayya, ನೀ ಕೇಳಿದರೆ ಕೇಳು, ಕೇಳದಿದ್ದರೆ ಮಾಡು. ನಾನಿನ್ನ ಹಾಡಿದಲ್ಲದೆ ಸೈರಿಸಲಾರೆನಯ್ಯ. ಅಯ್ಯ, ನೀನೊಲಿದರೆ ಒಲಿ, ಒಲಿಯದಿದ್ದರೆ ಮಾಡು. ನಾನಿನ್ನ ಪೂಜಿಸಿದಲ್ಲದೆ ಸೈರಿಸಲಾರೆನಯ್ಯ. ಅಯ್ಯ, ನೀ ಮೆಚ್ಚಿದರೆ ಮೆಚ್ಚು, ಮೆಚ್ಚದಿದ್ದರೆ ಮಾಡು. ನಾ ನಿನ್ನ ನಪ್ಪಿದಲ್ಲದೆ ಸೈರಿಸಲಾರೆನಯ್ಯ. ಅಯ್ಯ, ನೀ ನೋಡಿದರೆ ನೋಡು, ನೋಡದಿದ್ದರೆ ಮಾಡು. ನಾನಿನ್ನ ನೋಡಿ ಹೀಗೆ ಹಾರೈಸಿದಲ್ಲದೆ ಸೈರಿಸಲಾರೆನಯ್ಯ. ಚೆನ್ನಮಲ್ಲಿಕಾರ್ಜುನಯ್ಯ, ನಾ ನಿಮ್ಮ ಪೂಜಿಸಿ ಹರ್ಷದಲ್ಲಿ ಓಲಾಡುವೆನಯ್ಯ. And there's another one about which we had a fight. So I'll read that. That is the Arundhathi and I. We had a fight? Yeah. So, yeah.
I was clearly deep in meditation. I don't remember this at all.
See, Kannada has this twin, Virukti it's called. Sarasarne nadedaru, galagalane attaru, etc. So it's a very powerful way of putting things, So I'll read this poem to you. You tell me, have I done it right, or would it have been done? Should it have been done differently, or could it have been done differently?
I'm not sure that's a fair question, but do.
Yeah. Melting like moist soil, slipping like dry sand, pining in my dream, I turn distraught. Whirling like kiln fire, I seized, not a friend in sight. Chenamallikarjuna, grant me a body that cannot be seen by seeking, a bliss that cannot be had by coupling. So, see here in Kannada, ಎರೆಯಂತೆ ಕರಕರಗಿ ಮಳಲಂತೆ ಜರಿ ಜರಿದು ಕನಸಿನಲ್ಲಿ ಕಳವಳಿಸಿ ಆನು ಬೆರಗಾದೆ. ಆವಗೆಯ ಕಿಚ್ಚಿನಂತೆ ಸುಳಿ ಸುಳಿದು ಬೆಂದೆ. ಆಪತ್ತಿಗೆ ಸಖಿಯನು ನಾನಾರುವನು ಕಾಣೆ. ಅರಸಿ ಕಾಣದ ತನುವ ಬೆರಸಿ ಕೂಡದ ಸುಖವ ಎನಗೆ ನೀ ಕರುಣಿಸು ಚೆನ್ನಮಲ್ಲಿಕಾರ್ಜುನ. ಕನ್ನಡದಲ್ಲಿ ಎರೆಯಂತೆ ಕರಕರಗಿ ಮಳಲಂತೆ ಜರಿ ಜರಿದು, it enacts the process. So I would like to translate it as melting like moist soil, slipping like dry sand, pining in my dream, I turn distraught, whirling like kill fire. More effective, I would have thought, but English doesn't allow this as a very felicitous way of putting things. So I said, okay, boss. So, time for one more? Of course. Yeah. Okay. Even in Kannada, this is unusual because none of the male poets, I don't think they have used this kind of a language or style to say what they want to say. Look at that sense of urgency with which she says this. Hunger, wait a minute. Thirst, wait a minute. Sleep, wait a minute. Lust, wait a minute. Anger, wait a minute. Passion, wait a minute. Greed, wait a moment. Arrogance, wait a moment. Envy, wait a moment. Every moving and non-moving thing, I beseech you, wait a moment. I am your supplicant, carrying an urgent missive from my Lord Chenamallikarjuna. So, put everything on hold. Put everything on hold. So, this is in Kannada. Hasive, neenu nillu nillu. Trishege, neenu nillu nillu. Nidreye, neenu nillu nillu. Kamave, neenu nillu nillu. Krodhave, neenu nillu nillu. Mohave, neenu nillu nillu. Lobhave, neenu nillu nillu. Madave, neenu nillu nillu. Machcharave, ನೀನು ನಿಲ್ಲು ನಿಲ್ಲು. ಸಚರಾಚರವೇ ನೀನು ನಿಲ್ಲು ನಿಲ್ಲು. ನಾ ಚೆನ್ನಮಲ್ಲಿಕಾರ್ಜುನ ದೇವರ ಅವಸರದ ಓಲೆಯನ್ನು ಯುತ್ತಲಿದ್ದೇನೆ ಶರಣಾರ್ಥಿ. That is Akka for you.
And I'd like to invite Ahalya Balal to read some of the other poets in the Vachana tradition that she's translated. And I don't remember a fight, but I do remember I must say, the reason this book took 5 years is because I just enjoyed the email exchanges I was having with some of the translators. I do remember a very long email exchange. And that was one of the reasons that this book became pleasurable.
Yeah, thank you, Arundhathi. After Akka, the other Vachanakartis who are not as well known as Akka. I remember a poem by Arundhathi in another earlier collection where she speaks of, I speak for girls with orange lunch boxes, something like that, yeah? The ones who play tree number 3 in an orchard of 8 in the school annual play. So I was very much reminded of that when she asked me whether I would like to translate. So I just want to read out Akka Mahadevi. A brief background in Arundhathi's words. The poetic utterances of 33 women associated with the spiritual efflorescence of the Sharana movement in 12th century Karnataka have endured. Many of these women poets were married to men who were their spiritual partners as well as poets in their own right. Akka Mahadevi and her husband Mahadeva renounced a life of privilege in Kashmir to migrate south to Kalyana in Karnataka. This was the locus of the great spiritual community established by the poet, reformer and visionary Basavanna. Mani Rao referred to Basavanna earlier. Yeah. The Sharana movement fostered by him was a vibrant initiative that offered sanctuary to many. It boasted of the famous Anubhava Mantapa, experience pavilion, a crucible for mystics, philosophers, spiritual seekers and poets. The focus here was on inner experience rather than doctrine or ritual, and on subjective insight rather than dogma. Akka Mahadevi. Ava ಬೀಜವ ಬಿತ್ತಿದಳು ಪೃಥ್ವಿಗೆ ಬೇರು ಬಯಲಿಂಗೆ ಶಾಖೆ ತಲೆದೋರಿ ಬೆಳೆವಂತೆ ಐಕ್ಯಕ್ಕೆ ಮರೆ ಕ್ರಿಗೆ ಬಾಹ್ಯ ಉಭಯದ ಭೇದವುಳ್ಳನ್ನಕ್ಕ ಭಕ್ತಿಯ ಹೋರಾಟ ಬಿಡದು ಎನ್ನಯ್ಯ ಪ್ರಿಯ ಇಮ್ಮಡಿ ನಿಕ್ಕಳಂಕ ಮಲ್ಲಿಕಾರ್ಜುನ ಮಣಿಯುಳ್ಳನ್ನಕ್ಕ ಪವಣಿಕೆಯ ಹಂಗು ಬಿಡದು. Whatever the seed sown, roots grow into the earth, branches head out into the sky. Union is within, action is without. As long as duality exists, there's struggle in devotion. O beloved of my Lord, the twice pristine Mallikarjuna, as long as beads exist, the act of stringing is inevitable. Then there's Lingama. I'm quite ashamed. I've done an MA in Kannada. I work in the field of advertising. I do translations in Kannada. I've never heard of Lingama so far until Arundhathi pointed out. Yeah? So Lingama's work suggests a woman of no mean spiritual accomplishment. In one poem, she asks rhetorically, for one who has transcended the body, is there any more to learn? In another, she says, the devotee who has overcome the three, seeing, seer, and sight, has ascended the 3 summits. The crisp precision of her words seemed to emerge from a wealth of subjective experience, suggesting that Lingama knew whereof she spoke. Her language is marked by unadorned clarity and profundity and is described by scholar-translator H.S. Shivaprakash as cryptic but haunting. Lingama. Ayya, ಕಿಚ್ಚಿನೊಳಗೆ ಬೆಂದ ಕಾಯಕ್ಕೆ ಅಚ್ಚುಗ ಉಂಟೆ, ತಾನು ತಾನಾದ ಬಳಿಕ ಮಾನವರ ಹಂಗುಂಟೆ, ಮನವು ಮಹದಲ್ಲಿ ನಿಂದ ಬಳಿಕ ಮರವೆಯುಂಟೆ, ತನುವ ಮರೆದಂಗೆ ಇನ್ನರಿಯಬೇಕೆಂಬ ಅರುಹುಂಟೆ, ಬೆಳಗ ಕಂಡವಂಗೆ ಕತ್ತಲೆಯ ಹಂಗುಂಟೆ, ಇವೆಲ್ಲವನ್ನು ಹಿಂಗಿ ಮಹಾಘನದಲ್ಲಿ ಬೆರೆದ ಶರಣಂಗೆ ನಮೋ ನಮೋ ಎಂದು ಸುಖಿಯಾದನಯ್ಯ ಅಪ್ಪಣ್ಣ ಪ್ರಿಯ ಚೆನ್ನಬಸವಣ್ಣ. Sir, once a body burns in a blaze, does it know distress? When the self comes into its own, does it rely on other human beings? When the mind is fixed on the immensity, Does any illusion remain? For one who has transcended the body, is there any more to learn? Does one who has seen the light need darkness anymore? O Chenna Basavanna, dear to Appanna, I bow down in joy to the devotee who has overcome all this and dissolved into the great divine. Thank you. Is it time for one more? Yeah? Okay, then this is one of Arundhathi's favorites. This is written by Sule Sankava, a profession. She's a prostitute by profession. Her work seamlessly combines the gritty reality of her work with her love of Shiva. ಒತ್ತೆಯ ಹಿಡಿದು ಮತ್ತೊತ್ತೆಯ ಹಿಡಿಯೇ ಹಿಡಿದಡೆ ಬತ್ತಲೆ ನಿಲ್ಲಿಸಿ ಕೊಲುವರಯ್ಯ ವ್ರತಹೀನನ ನರಿದು ಬೆರೆದಡೆ ಕಾದ ಕತ್ತಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಕೈ ಕಿವಿ ಮೂಗ ಕೊಯ್ವರಯ್ಯ ಒಲ್ಲೆನೊಲ್ಲೆ ಬಲ್ಲೆನಾಗಿ ನಿಮ್ಮಾಣೆ ನಿರ್ಲಜ್ಜೇಶ್ವರ. She calls him Nirlajjeshwara, that is a shameless one. Having accepted my fee from one man, I shall not accept it from another. Should I do that? They'll make me stand naked and kill me, sir. Should I knowingly mingle with someone who is not loyal and true? They'll cut off my hands, ears, and nose with a red-hot sword, sir. I'm going to do no such thing, I know. I swear on you, O shameless Lord. Thank you.
I'm going to ask Mani to read one of her translations in the book. And Mani has two sets of translations in the book. One is a series of poems that I drew from her book, The Saundarya Lehari, which she's of course translated. But the other was a poet whom I requested her to translate. I'm not sure which one you'd like to read. Is it the poet that I requested you to translate? So, Tarigonda Venkamamba is one hell of a woman. And before Mani reads her, I just want to say that she became one of the reasons I returned to this project on an occasion when I was ready to give it up. And I returned because Tarigonda Venkamamba is this woman who is a widow, but insists on flouting every norm associated with conventional widowhood. She wears flowers in her hair, she wears colored clothes, she wears a Mangal Sutra, she wears her vermilion. This is in the 18th century. And there's a lovely story of the elders being outraged by her independence. And they take her to the supreme pontiff, the Shankaracharya, and ask her to bow down before him. She refuses. And when they insist, she asks him to rise. He does. And she bows down before the empty seat. And in the wonderful moment of poetic justice, which doesn't happen too often in folklore and hagiography, particularly associated with women, in a wonderful moment, we are told that the entire seat went up in flames. That's what happens when Tarigonda Venkamamba bows. And to me, that anecdote was really one of the reasons to return and to say there is a reason to hear all these women together, to honor their singularity, but to hear them together in polyphony as well.
So actually each section in the book has the story as part of the introduction. So not only do we get the historical information, but also the legend associated with that person, and then that's followed by the translation. When Arundhathi asked me to translate Tarigonda Venkamamba, I said, no, yeah, not really, I've got this to do, and I've got that to do, and I won't be able to do this, etc. And she said, well, if you change your mind, let me know. And I never wrote back to her. A few weeks later, she emailed me again and said, Mani, hi, have you changed your mind? And you think you want to approach it now? I said, okay, well, I'll have to see what this is. And Mutyala Harati, which is the famous song that everybody knows about, which is sung in Tirupati, I had heard it, but I had never known that it was composed by Tarigonda Venkamamba. The poem that I actually enjoyed the most out of the three that I've translated here is called Chedudante Nemi, Manchidante Nemi, and that is the one I'm going to read you in English, in the translation. What's bad, what's good? So what if they call you bad or good? Why so much tossing and torment? They mistook your body for you and reproached you, yes? But who has seen the inner self that they can berate it? Why do you argue with the arrogant? Your support this master who moves in everyone. O mind, is there anyone who has seen you? Who has figured the mind's ways? Who has pondered the real, unreal? Why get all tangled in false words? Why grieve when you hear insults? Why puff up when you get praise? The Lord of the Serpent Mountain, Tarigonda's master, is witness to both wrong and right. He listens to what people profess. A mighty one, this boss, watches what's what. So be good, be truly good.
Thank you, Mani.
You have been listening to BIC Talks by Bangalore International Centre. If you like what you heard, do follow us on social media. Keep up with our programming by signing up for our mailer on the website or leave us a review or rating on Apple Podcasts or iTunes. The crew that makes these podcasts possible is Gaurav Krishna and Ishan Gupta on sound supervision and production, with support from S. Sarunaraj and Raghu Tenkaila. Artwork is designed by Chandni Venkataraman of Crisscross Design Studio. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. It can also be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcentre.org. This is Lekha Naidu signing off on behalf of everyone at BIC.